death is defined, and we diagnose people with death really, when three criteria are met. When there's no heartbeat, when there's no breathing, and the brain stops functioning. So many of you have seen that in hospitals we shine a light on the pupils, on the eyes, and we look to see if that reflex is gone. If that reflex goes, that tells us that the brainstem, the area that keeps us alive, has stopped functioning, as has the rest of the brain. So when those three criteria are met, that means somebody is dead. But think about it for a moment. Now, when that happens, of course, many different things can lead to that happening. You know, you could have a heart attack, you could have a stroke, you could have had a car accident, you could have severe infections. Some kind of process eventually, and you can see that by the pyramid, leads to that final point where the heart stops beating and you reach that point of death. But what happens to your body at that time? Well, we know that because of the lack of blood flow into the brain at that moment, there are changes that take place almost immediately to the brain cells. Now, if there's no blood getting into the brain for a few minutes, then those changes start to lead to permanent changes that become damaging to the cells. And so you start to go through a phase where the cells become more and more damaged, and this can go on for a period of time. But if you think about it, they go through what we call cell death. And this process, again, look at it more globally. What happens to us when we die? Well, the body eventually decomposes. So the cells start to go through change immediately, and ultimately it culminates in this decomposition when we are nothing. So a question that arises, of course, and this process goes on over hours and days, is what happens to the human mind and consciousness at that point? Right? So we know that the heart stops beating, but at what point does our mind and consciousness cease functioning? Is it immediate, as soon as the heart stops? Is it for a few seconds? Is it for a few minutes? Is it for a few hours? Who knows? We have no idea about what happens to the human mind and the self at that time. But what we do know is that at the early phase, because the damage is not extensive, potentially we can bring people back to life. And this could be for a few seconds, tens of minutes, maybe even over an hour of time. And that's why we perform cardiac arrest resuscitation. We try to bring people back to life. So if we can get a group of people back to life, what they experience during that first few minutes, maybe even over an hour of time, gives us a unique window of understanding into what we will all experience during death. Because death and cardiac arrest are really synonymous. We call it a cardiac arrest when we try to resuscitate somebody. We press on their chest, we give them shock, we give them drugs, and when we don't succeed, we say the person is dead. If we don't intervene, we say the person was dead. So it's really the same thing. A cardiac arrest is defined by no heartbeat, no activity of the breathing, no activity of the lungs, and studies have shown that within about 10 seconds the brain also stops functioning. You cannot measure any electricity within the brain at that time. Now, interestingly, over the last 30 years, and it's wonderful that we have Professor Bruce Grayson here, who really is probably, in my opinion, the world's leading expert on near-death experiences here. There have been reports of people who've had these unusual experiences when they've come close to death, what we call a near-death experience. People have typically described feeling very peaceful, feeling joyous, seeing a bright light, seeing deceased relatives, going to a very beautiful place, sometimes even having a panoramic review of their entire lives. Now, the problem with this, although it's very interesting from a scientific point of view, is that they're very vague. You know, what do we mean by near death? What does it mean? Except to say that people do seem to have very interesting, unusual experiences when they've been close to death. And because it's been so vague throughout the last couple of, I should say maybe 10, 20 years or so, there's been a lot of controversy about this. So this has led a number of researchers like myself and Professor Grayson and a number of others around the world to try to study this, what happens to the mind and consciousness, objectively at the point of death. In other words, cardiac arrest. Not near death, but at the point of death. And so we've started to study this in this particular model, which is the same as death, as I mentioned to you. And interestingly, a number of studies carried out by different researchers, one by myself, one by Professor Grayson, and a couple of other people, have shown that about 10 to 20% of people who have gone through clinical death, been brought back to life, will report lucid, well-structured thought processes with reasoning and memory formation. And interestingly, a subgroup of those people will also tell us precisely what we were doing. So although that experience is very subjective, and we cannot study it scientifically as such, a group of them come back and say, I was at the ceiling, and I could see Dr. Smith, he walked into the room, and they can tell us exactly what we were doing, what we were saying. And those details have been, when you speak to the medical and nursing staff, have been validated by the people who were there. And so really it's led to a scientific paradox, because it appears that we have consciousness present when there is no activity of the brain. And I think this will have huge implications for solving the mind-body problem.